Welcome to the Recover You podcast. I'm Kylene.
And I'm Patrick.
We are a couple in recovery
From sex addiction
and betrayal trauma. Together, we share our story to encourage you on your journey. It's here that we talk about sex addiction, betrayal trauma, mental, emotional, and physical health, faith, and anything and everything needed to recover you to your most authentic self that God created you to be. All right. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, Kylene.
The end is very important. How are you today?
I'm doing good. I just got home from work. I had a good day. I'm feeling good. Lots of good things happening.
You're healthy again.
I'm healthy again. I actually ran outside this morning.
Yay.
Yeah, first time since last April. So after following my knee surgery. So I'm.
Oh, that's right. I think we shared that on the podcast.
Yeah, that I did have surgery.
That you had the surgery and everything. Yep. And so that was a long PT recovery process. And
yeah, so
big moment for you.
Yeah, it was a big moment. Yep. Feels good. Nice and warm. I got rained on while I was running, which is one of my favorite things.
Yay. All right. So last week we started this open conversation around sex after recovery. And today we're continuing that conversation with the topic of reestablishing true intimacy with sex. So I would say that our journey was long.
Yeah, that's long. It was long.
In reestablishing. But there's no right or wrong when it comes to the timeline. So one of the things that we just want to share with you on this episode is to trust your intuition while simultaneously being respectful of your partner's pace if it happens to be slower than you, because the two of you can really only move as quickly as the slowest partner when it comes to intimacy.
Yeah, and I think one of the keys to this too is try very hard not to compare in this, because this is your relationship, much like your relationship is born out of your own individual family stories, and you come together in when there is no trauma. In this is your own relationship, and you have to understand that you're going to move at different paces. So as you talk to, maybe a lot of times when you get into, the addict is around other addicts, and you may experience these things where you're looking to the person next to you and they're like, hey, we're doing great. And it's been like 30 days, just remember everybody's different. And just because, let's say maybe they're being physically intimate before you, it may not mean that it's right. It may not mean that they're actually doing good, deep work. So you always have to think about that just, the marker is not, hey, we're having sex. That's not the objective of what you're trying to do. You want to have a connection that is safe and deep and right and all of these things. You don't want to rush into these things.
Yeah, and I think I would remove the word right, just because, we don't want to cast any judgments on anybody's personal choices within their own relationship. There's really not necessarily a right or wrong, but what we are trying to encourage everyone in is that there is a deeper way to connect with each other that's worth waiting for.
Correct.
And for me personally, like throughout this process, there were many times, and probably you remember this because I would actually come up to you, where I just felt broken. Like I felt like there was something wrong with me.
Mm-hmm. I remember you used to say that. You're like, there's something wrong with me. What's wrong with me? And
yeah, because for us, it was very slow. And, honestly, this is probably the most vulnerable podcast we may ever record, because this part of our relationship was not something that I spoke to very many people about at all, because it's personal, right? It's very personal. And I needed to take it at my own time, in my own time. And it was not going well for a while in terms of I wasn't ready, and I was very frustrated, and I had so much trauma around sex and sexuality and my body. And I was so deeply wounded in that area. And I had so much that was around feeling confident in my body and just so many things. For me, it was like 20 layers deep. And I really felt broken. I mean, that's the best word for it, I think. And what got me through, I think, was a couple things. One, it was knowing that you were never going to pressure me to go faster than I was ready. Two, it was holding this vision of what I thought we could actually accomplish. And I know that as long as our process took, and we'll kind of talk about what that process looked like. But what I mean is like actually getting to the place of finally reconnecting with intercourse and penetration. Like that was like this high mountain for me to climb of I had to take it one step at a time, one trauma response at a time, and to get back to that place of connection. And I think both of us were sometimes frustrated with the process, but we were both committed. And I think at the end, we were both like, oh, that's why we had to do it that way.
Right.
And we were both like, oh, that was actually really worth it.
Yeah. And I know on top, you were talking about your own brokenness and your own fear and your own just inability as you were kind of moving through this to kind of be where you wanted to be. And I mentioned this on the last podcast too, and this has become more apparent as I've looked back, is how broken I was. I remember you asking me early on in recovery, do you even know what love is? And so as I'm working through all of that and we're trying to be intimate and I'm trying to be the best guy I can be because I wasn't before, there was so much in my mind. I was broken too. I was very broken and I didn't know necessarily how to show up for you. I think the one thing I could hold to, and you mentioned it to you, is I could very much not rush you and I could very much be present for you as you felt the pain of this. That, I don't know if I felt like that's the one thing I could do. That's the one thing I could very much do. The other stuff was really hard, and you would say things like, why aren't you pursuing me? And I'd be like, I don't really know.
Well, and that's like one of the things I think on the betrayed side, it's really frustrating. It's like, excuse me, you're a sex addict. You were acting out sexually all the time. Now that you're not doing that, why is that energy not going towards me? And that's a natural response. But we always want to sort of question, I don't want to become a negative replacement. I don't want to attract the negative energy. What I want and what we had an opportunity to do was strip it all the way down to the horrible trauma core for both of us in terms of how we viewed it, what our history with it was, what our fears were, what our insecurities were. And then we had to actually create something totally new. We couldn't even really base it on what our previous sex life was. We couldn't base it on where we were. We had to base it on what we thought was healthy and what we began to sort of understand could culminate in this spiritual, emotional, safe connection of two people with the expression of this physical thing. And that's sort of what I had in my mind that sort of pushed me forward, even though it was so uncomfortable. But I want to make it clear here. So for anyone that sort of resonates with the slow timeline, I hear you. I feel you. Patrick was checking off every box and it was still very, very hard for me. So I have so much empathy for you if that is you. And I think part of the reason that it was so hard for me is because this was not the only trauma in my life. There were so many before this that were within the realm of sexuality. And so that made this extra hard, having those layers. And so I think that makes a big difference when somebody comes with baggage maybe in this area, or even, to your point, saying, you had stuff to deal with too. Addiction and utilizing pornography and masturbation and things like that in ways that are unhealthy. Well, all pornography is unhealthy. I'll just clarify that. But your relationship with sexuality up to that point had a lot of lack of health. And so pornography and addiction is very, it's an intimacy disorder. So in some senses, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, how you would say this for your own personal life experience, but maybe for some addicts, this is the first time they've ever had the opportunity to reevaluate all of the different beliefs that they have about sex and their body and how they connect with another human being. And it's an opportunity to experience connection with sex in a way that they've never done before.
Yeah, 100%. I mentioned this in the last episode about 90 days of celibacy. Might have been the first time in a man's life where he went 90 days since puberty, without, but very much, you have the awkward, pubescent, let's say, hanging out with your girlfriend or whatever, and, you're not supposed to, and there's shame involved and things like that. And so I actually, I've always looked at you and I as being like the best part of my sexuality, always, from day one to here. It was damaged in there because of the secrets and the lies and stuff like that. And so coming out of it and saying, okay, now I have an opportunity to reconnect with this person, you, who I have always wanted to just be the engage in the most connected way that I ever can. And now I have an opportunity to do it right. And so I think it was scary. It was, there were times where I was like, I don't know if we get past the hurt. I think I actually said to you, and I've said to you multiple times about this, I was like, sometimes the hurt or the damage is just so bad. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? It's just so, I remember saying that, something to that effect to you, I think, when we've had this, because I was like, well, I understand why she doesn't want to open up to me, because I've wrought all this damage. And so, yeah, it was a very vulnerable, scary thing. I was actually sitting here as I'm watching you talk, and I was like, I'm amazed that you could hold that vision in light of everything that was happening. You could still have that in your mind, and it's hard to even like think, like, how could you have been able to do that? And we were working through all of this stuff and discovery and disclosure, and you're thinking in your mind, I want us, at some future point, 3, 10, 65 years, whatever that may be,
when we're in heaven,
that we're going to have this beautiful connection. And it's just, I think that's an amazing, unique thing about you, that you were able to hold that. I don't know what that is about you, but it's pretty special.
Oh, thanks. We're getting all emotional over here. Yeah, man. Well, I think that when we talk about the timing of how everything came out, I don't know that I could have done that before. I think I was exposed to the right information over time that gave me, and hopefully we're offering this to other people now, it gave me the hope that that was a possibility.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, with my belief system, and my faith, that did not come from the church for me.
Yeah.
It came from other sources.
Right.
And so that is a really unfortunate thing, because I wish that church talked about this differently so that we could have this hope on both sides. And because I think that, you can go back to having sex, but what I have come to understand sometimes is people can have intercourse and physical sex and not be connected in any other area of their relationship. And that's not what I wanted and not what I felt comfortable with. And it was like when I was exposed to this idea that it could actually be something better, I was like, well, maybe that's a possibility. And I didn't know. I did not know. And I really doubted it as we continued.
Oh, yeah.
To be honest, but mostly I doubted myself because I was just in so much pain. And so there was, there's so much trauma that we alluded to this idea that there's so much trauma that gets, stored in the body. And what I really learned through this process of navigating this with you is how much sexual trauma has been stored in my body, mm-hmm. and how much trauma around sexuality and safety and connecting with a partner was just stuck. And, they say the issues are in the tissues, right?
Right.
And one of the things that has happened fairly consistently through the process of reconnecting for us was that we would connect and I would cry, right? And these different experiences I would have, and we'll kind of get a little more specific here in a minute. But yeah, I think it was, like I said, it's very unfortunate that didn't come from my faith background.
Yeah.
But however, I do think that my faith background played into why I believe that it's possible. And I believe like that's how it's created to be and how we're designed to connect with other human beings. And so it played into my acceptance and my belief in it, but it was definitely not my exposure to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about what her actual process was, because it was hard. It was so hard. Okay. So going all the way back to the beginning, we went through discovery and we talked about our experience with the 90 days, right? Like we didn't just go, hey, like we're not connecting in sexual ways at all, zero, not at all. Like we still allowed for some version of sexual interaction, based on what I felt safe with and that sort of thing. This is the moment in the podcast where I'm going to say, again, we're going to do our best to be clear and yet appropriate in the way we communicate, but also sometimes I might say things that, please know where you are in recovery. Also know if you have like I do, like a visual mind where if you're not in a place in recovery right now, we're hearing us sort of walk through our process of connecting physically. Like if I'm going to go through some descriptions of some of the exercises that we did to move through my trauma. And if that is potentially triggering for either one of you, maybe it's safer for one of you to listen and communicate to the other partner. Please know that. Okay. I want to make you very aware because I definitely don't want to be communicating something that we hope is positive and end up kind of triggering you through this process. Yeah. So I'm going to try to be as appropriate as possible while still actually clearly communicating. Because I think that was one of the frustrating things too, like was when we were going through recovery is sometimes when people talk about stuff, they beat around the bush too much. And I don't want to do that, but I also want to provide safety. So that is the official trigger warning here. Okay. So when we started going through this fairly early on, I hired a sex and relationship coach. I think it was about 4 months in. And actually, next week or the week after, there's going to be an episode with her here on the podcast as well. So you'll get to meet her. She's great. And, I knew myself, I knew my body, I knew my reaction to this. And I was like, I'm going to need help. I'm going to need help. And so I reached out. She's a friend of mine. I've met her in person several times. She's so nice. And my experience with that was a lot of gently meeting me where I was in the process and not pushing me too hard. But there were some really neat exercises that she gave me or gave us as a couple that were more towards trauma healing, more towards connecting to the safety within my body and connecting to you in a healthy way. And I don't know if you remember this, but one of them was you talking to my parts.
Oh yeah, I do remember that. Yep.
And so the recording of these episodes is a little bit out of order. So I actually just recorded her episode earlier today, and so I was remembering that in that episode, and it was such a good exercise for us to go through because I think I cried.
You did. Yeah.
Imagine that.
I know, really.
Taking turns crying,
Yeah.
But so this is what I mean. This is an example of what I'm talking about when people you can go all the way to penetration and intercourse and not have this type of connection. That was such a cool thing. And see, now we get emotional. To go through where here I am. And yes, granted, you were the one that hurt me. But here I am feeling super vulnerable, super insecure in my body, kind of like in a place of fighting against it or trying to control or trying to, whatever around it. And then you're like saying these really, really nice things to my body.
Yeah. And just to clarify, I wasn't saying sexual or desiring things to your body. I was like, it's almost like how you would talk to somebody you were really proud of. It was a long.
You did. Yeah. I think you said, because I think we did it a few times. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe you talked to my breasts. I think you definitely talked to my uterus several
Mm-hmm.
times. Cause I think that's where I kind of, at the point that we were doing this exercise, I was like, I think there's a lot of trauma stored in my uterus.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think you talked to my vagina as well.
Yeah.
And over the course of different things. But I think what I'm remembering is specifically when you were talking to my uterus and you were like, I'm so proud of you. And it's okay, you're safe.
Mm-hmm.
And I love you. And you were using words like that. And it was just really just such an interesting experience. And you don't have to be naked when you're doing this, right?
No.
I think I was laying on the bed clothed.
Right.
Maybe sometimes I wasn't. I can't remember exactly every detail, but I think you can do it either way, whatever you're most comfortable with. But I had a lot of modesty boundaries in the beginning where I did not want you to see certain parts of me.
Right.
And so I think a lot of these types of exercises were clothed, and but you still were talking to my parts and these parts of me that were holding pain. And so that is a really cool thing. And so that was part of that early process that we went through. Do you remember anything sort of also within that phase that we were doing kind of in that early part? That was super early on. I think that was, yeah. And I think we were still engaging in some behaviors, but here's the thing. This is where I'm going to try really hard not to get explicit, but still communicate so you kind of have an idea without it being inappropriate. So I would have a lot of modesty boundaries, but I also was having a lot of trouble with the idea of you receiving sexual pleasure.
Right.
Because I felt like that was very unfair, that you essentially, anytime you wanted it, would go do whatever you wanted. And that was not my life experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that, it's essentially like the tables were, the weights were not equal, right?
Yeah.
The scales were not balanced, is what I mean to say.
Mm-hmm.
And also because we were still so early on in the process, I don't know necessarily the words to use here. I didn't want to feel used. I honestly didn't really want to give you the gift.
Mm-hmm.
I guess if you wanted to say it that way.
Yeah.
But I also didn't want to completely shut off the sexual part of myself. And so sometimes we would interact in a way where you would, here's where I'm like, how do we use the words that are the most appropriate?
Yeah.
Like you would pleasure me.
Yeah.
But I would be like almost completely clothed. Or if I wasn't completely clothed, the blankets would be on top of us.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so you would be sort of working on my body, and but I wouldn't be having you see parts of me. Okay. And so that's how we sort of would still kind of keep the door open within the level of what I was comfortable with at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal was always to identify the next step and kind of figure out, what am I comfortable with? What am I not comfortable with? And then there was this point at which, there's a difference between what is unsafe and what you're not ready for, and what you are ready for, but you're just a little nervous about.
I think we actually stayed in that phase for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it was, and I think a lot of it was because we didn't quite necessarily know how to move forward. And there was a lot of healing that was happening. So there was, disclosure and empathy letters and all of these different things we had to get through the summer. And then I think we had to pass through like our anniversary date. There was just all of these like things that we had to kind of, so it was like we had stepped up, we had leveled to a point, and we stayed a level 7 for, for 8 months or whatever it was. And it was actually okay. It was, we got comfortable, I think, in that level. I think you're what I recall, your that bitterness that you talked about, that out of balance, I think that faded a little bit.
Yeah, I think I started, I don't know, reciprocating to some extent.
Right.
At some point.
Yeah.
Because that was another piece of it. There were so many minefields around it of like, okay, well, let's interact in this way, but I don't want you to touch yourself because I associate that with, and so like, okay, well, if we want to help you, then I have to, right? And so it was just like, it was so messed up.
Right.
It was so messed up. So one of the biggest things that really ended up kind of pushing me forward in a healing way was when I went to my practitioner certification, and it was like the 7 to 8 day training. It was in person. I did a lot of trauma work, and I started working on. I had already done therapy. I had already done EMDR, and then I went through this, and it really started to help me continue my progress after I felt like I was hitting a wall. And I remember I went like in therapy because like everybody wanted to help us in this area, right? Like everybody was like pro us moving forward, and we were like, we want to move forward too, but like it just doesn't feel right. Yeah. And so they had given, I mentioned this in the podcast too, that book that we had been given that was about reestablishing intimacy after betrayal and everything. And they have these exercises in there called PIEs, personal intimacy experiences. And I freaking hated that book. And I think part of it was that the exercises maybe were not the right ones for us. And part of it might have been the time.
That's right. Yeah. It may have come to you too soon. And had it been 8, 9, 10 months later, it might have been like, all right, whatever, let's just, let's kind of go. So I think that was a big part of it. I think
having my history, the reestablishment of safety in our relationship may have taken longer than what might be quote unquote typical or what a lot of people may experience. I don't know. I felt like it was a long time for me to be able to relax. And every little baby step that we took moved me in that direction, but it felt to me agonizingly slow.
Yeah.
And I know you felt like that in a lot of ways, but
what was interesting with me is like I wanted to connect 100% that way. But I also was like, I never felt impatient about it. I don't think I ever was frustrated. I was never, ever frustrated by it. And so, because I was just like, well, this is the process. And I was also kind of like, and it's like, sometimes there's consequences for what you do, right? And if the consequence is that we never connect that way, part of me was like, that's just the way. And it was very much ingrained in my mind. So I think that I never had this impatient feeling about it at all, which is, which I think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I actually think that was incredibly important because had you not, I don't know that we would have made it had you pressured me in any way in this area whatsoever.
Yeah.
Because of the level of trauma and fear and insecurity and pain in this area in my life and the way I was responding to it, you had to create a safe place for me or we couldn't have reconnected.
Yeah.
It just would not have, it would have been, had there been any pressure, it would have been a very abusive thing. The way that I was responding, because I was very wounded. And so to pressure somebody that's wounded is just unkind.
Yeah.
And so you were willing to do the work, and it really gave me the time and space to process. And then, now, like you were saying, looking back, you ended up realizing you had a lot of things that you needed to kind of work through with your own body and your own perspective of what sex is and that sort of thing as well. And so it ended up working out. And I think it needed to take the amount of time that it took.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so getting back to the steps though, so what we ended up doing, so we had this book and I was like, I freaking hate this book. It was so triggering to me. I was like, I can't do this. But it did implant the idea of pies in my mind. So at some point when I started kind of moving forward again, I got to this place where I was like, okay, safety is established. Now it's just nervousness. And I am familiar with my patterns of modesty. And, I've created a sense of comfort around these different behaviors that we have originally placed for safety, but now it's just comfortable. Safety is definitely there at this point.
Right.
I'm ready to take the next step, even if I'm nervous, right? So there's, again, a difference between overriding your nervous system to do something you're not ready for and saying, okay, I'm ready, but I'm just a little scared. Okay. So I would notice when I was ready but scared and create my own pie experiences for us to go through. So I'm going to walk through a couple of what those are, because I think it's really important because, again, people can have physical intercourse and be like, oh, well, okay, we've done it. We're good. We're connected in that area. But there's so much more, I think. Like if you can have, intercourse with somebody, can you sit across from them and gaze into their eyes and feel really comfortable with that? Can you, I think there was
and if you can't, what's going on there?
Right. And that's kind of my point. It's like these little things that we sort of overlook if we've been able to engage in a physical act, right? And so there's other pieces that can sort of lead up to or make that even better. Can you look at, so one of the first things, actually, I'm trying to think if it was the first thing that we did. Because I think this was really early on, kind of back in the same timeline of talking to my parts and stuff like that, where we sat across from each other and we did the eye gazing and we did the touching each other's hands. So again, totally clothed, sitting cross-legged across from each other on the bed or whatever, touching hand to hand. So we're creating a circuit between our two bodies, eye gazing. And I do think that was very uncomfortable, even that first year that we were doing it.
Yeah.
And now I think we'd be like, hey, what's up?
Right.
At the time, that, again, I was really struggling with these. I want to receive love, but it's kind of hard for me at that point to reciprocate and give love back.
Right.
And so that was a process for me to get to the place where I was like, okay, I can connect back and we can connect together and stuff like that. But that was one of the first things I think we did. And there may have even been something where we were saying things to each other during that. And I think there might have been another exercise where, I think actually this was in the Pies book. I think because we did do a couple before we called it quits. And I think one of them was listing out the things. I think they had a list of questions, and it was a bunch of things that like you're insecure about, and like opening up that conversation with your partner about your body and stuff like that, and having your partner like compliment you and stuff like that. So again, not throwing the book totally under the bus, just sharing my personal feelings about it in the moment. But anyway, again, so it implanted the idea of pies in my mind. So what I decided to do, being the manifestor that I am, not liking to be told exactly how to do things, I created them myself. So what I did was I was like, okay, well, the first step for me is going to be literally allowing you to look at me. And so I wasn't changing in front of you. I wasn't letting you see parts of my body, even if we would try to interact in some sexual way. Like there were just so many layers up. So one of the first things we did was sit on the bed across from each other, clothed, except I had my shirt off, but I had my bra on. And so I was practicing the most simple version of you looking at me and me becoming comfortable with it. And what we did was, I remember we did it in 3 parts. So I said, you're going to close your eyes. I'm going to sit here and get comfortable with the fact that I'm like this in front of you. And then I closed my eyes and asked you to look at me. So I sort of, without watching you and having all of the visual input of you seeing what you're seeing, watching your face and all this kind of stuff, I kept my eyes closed, but I knew that you were looking at me. And so I sat with that and kind of got comfortable with that idea. And then and this was all in the same like 10 minutes. And then I opened my eyes and like watched you look at me. And I think I had you like maybe look me up and down or something. I was like, so I was like watching you look at my body, and I was trying to get comfortable with that. And so that was like the very beginning steps of me kind of pulling back the modesty layer and saying, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to work up to real connection, real intimacy, and physical intercourse and get all the way up to that, climbing Mount Everest of sexuality, then I want to be comfortable and get comfortable basically with every step in between. How did you feel about that?
I remember it was kind of awkward because it's like, I remember asking you like, okay, are you okay? Are you okay? I'm looking up right now. I'm looking up, and then, okay, I'm looking down, and like I went through that. But there was always this, like, I remember there being like, okay, now what do I do? Like, you know what I mean? Like at the point where you're looking at me, look at you. But then I'm like, well, I don't want to ogle her. You know what I mean? Like I wanted to make sure that everything I did was like respectful. I didn't want to, so I didn't exclaim. I just looked like I didn't, if you recall, I wasn't like, wow, you look fantastic. The assignment was to look.
Yeah. And I want to make that very clear. How we approached these was as trauma exercises. That's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
We both went in with the understanding that this is not sexual engagement. The purpose is to move closer together in that area.
Yeah.
But in order to do that, we had to look at every trauma wound, every fear, every insecurity, and go through these exercises as trauma exercises with no expectation of sexual connection after that.
Right.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we didn't. We went through that exercise and then we were like, okay, let's go do something else right now. Right.
Yeah. Right.
So continuing with that process, then you can guess sort of the progression. So I think the very next time, and this was not the next day, by the way,
Right.
This is why it took us so long. I had to sit with that for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, okay, that happened. And I was like, oh, that wasn't so bad. Like, okay, that was okay. Right. And I sort of proved to myself that it was okay and it was safe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that was like layer number one. So then the next layer was obviously to sit topless.
Right.
And that's like a lot more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And a lot more uncomfortable. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was the exact same process though. Okay. I'm going to sit here and get comfortable with it. Then I'm going to know that you're looking at me and
Right.
seeing my body. And then I'm going to watch you watch me.
Right.
And so, the thing about this process is this is an incredibly vulnerable process.
Mm-hmm.
Like every step that we took. The other piece of that is we didn't do this before. Like when we got married, we didn't do this. Right.
Yeah.
And so I never want to say that, gosh, how do I wear this? Because I never, ever want to say trauma is a gift. Ever. It's like the most horrible thing ever. But when I look at the process that we went through because of this, it's something that we never would have had the opportunity to do, or maybe we would have had the opportunity to do it, but never chosen to do it. Right.
Right.
And it has completely dramatically changed our relationship, I think, in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
What makes you feel insecure? What are you afraid of? Let's create an exercise around that, or let's talk about that. Was kind of our whole thinking process.
Right.
So as you can imagine, these exercises continue to progress, and I'm not going to like vulgarate everyone. I'm not going to but I will we progressed through them. Okay. Yeah. We continue to progress step by step through the modesty boundaries. Every one of them was incredibly uncomfortable the first time, every single one. And we kind of went through that same process for every single one, where it was me kind of getting comfortable with the idea of what we were doing. The one that I will share was, we had really progressed in so many areas, and we had even really progressed through a lot of the modesty boundaries, but I was feeling really stuck again. Ironically enough, I went to my level 2 training where I became a master practitioner in all of these emotional processing techniques. And again, the reason those trainings were so impactful was because I wasn't just learning the techniques. You're immersed in them for the 7 days. You have to do them yourself. So there's a lot of energy moving. There's a lot of emotional processing that occurred within the training itself.
Mm-hmm.
But then I would come home and sort of have the forward movement to kind of keep going, right? And so I felt like I'd kind of maybe hit another wall. And when I came home from the level 2 training was when I was like, okay, I am incredibly scared, but ready for you to like look at my naked body, like in totality. And that was like, oh, like what a horrifying thought.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, it's so scary. It's so scary. Oh my gosh, it's so scary. But I was like, I need to do this. If we're going to keep progressing, like I need to do this. I need to trust you. I need to allow myself to feel comfortable in my body, and I need to do this. And I knew that it was the next step. Every day I would trust my own intuition and create the next step. You were not creating these. I was creating these. And so I was like, this is what I need to do. And I remember it really vividly because when we went through that exercise, same thing.
A key thing to that too is we did not do it in the bedroom either. We actually did it in the kitchen, if you recall.
I remember exactly where I was.
Yeah. So it actually, I mean, I think the beauty of that is it took
some of the pressure
further that expectation of like,
well, again, I was viewing
it to something.
Well, again, I was viewing it as a trauma exercise. I was like, okay, let's get this done. And like, I don't even know why we chose that area.
To the handle of the refrigerator.
I was like for dear life, probably. I don't know. No, I was on the corner of it, I think, but I don't know why, we chose the kitchen. I think maybe I just put the robe on and was ready to do the exercise and you were in the kitchen. And so I was like, okay, I'm ready. Right. Like, let's do this because I'm scared to death. Right. But I knew it was the moment to do it. But the thing that I remember so potently about that particular exercise was that, so I kind of had to get comfortable with the idea. Again, your eyes were closed. When we did the middle exercise where my eyes were closed and your eyes were open, I felt this whoosh of energy, like flooding my body of peace and calm. And then on the third part, when we were both looking at each other, I started sobbing.
Yeah.
So the second part, when I told you that, what did you say?
I was like, oh yeah, I was sending you positive energy. Yeah. I was
you literally
deliberately trying to do that.
You were trying to keep me calm.
Yeah.
And like send love my way. And I physically felt it. It was such an overwhelming feeling of calm presence on me. And then the last part where we both had our eyes, I just like, and that again was a physical, this was so fascinating to me. It was a physical sensation of trauma and energy moving through my body. Like it was like rushing out or whatever it was. And I was just sobbing at that point.
Yeah.
It was such a huge thing to accomplish.
Yeah.
It was such a big deal.
It was a big deal.
So again, the point of this isn't to be graphic, and gosh, I hope I didn't trigger any of you with some of these examples. But the idea was, I've started talking, this has come up in some of my client sessions and things like this. And I wanted to share because we shouldn't be scared to talk about this stuff. And we certainly shouldn't be afraid to be this intentional with our partner about reestablishing connection and intimacy. Because if we are committed to this person for the rest of our life, we get to choose what level of a relationship we have. And it can be a very transactional one, or it can be a very connected one. And a very emotionally, energetically, spiritually connected one. And so I think that it's important to be a little specific in some of the things that we did, because I hope that it's opening up some opportunities and some thoughts of maybe similar things that you can try in your relationship, conversations that you can have. You can create your own pies. They definitely don't have to be the same process or the same type or the same version. Like my encouragement would be, think about what makes you scared, what makes you uncomfortable, and then first create safety in your environment and in your relationship around that thing and around everything. And once safety is firmly established, then you can go, okay, what am I ready or what do I want to do, but I'm just nervous to do? It's totally safe to do. It's totally. And that might just mean like, again, like we said, like holding hands and gazing into each other's eyes. That might be learning how to tap into each other's energy. I know that sounds super woo, but we should totally do an episode on that because Patrick is like a super good energy giver. Like, it's really kind of amazing. But there's so many different ways that you can kind of connect with your partner through this process, and it can just create something totally new.
Yeah.
Totally new.
It's interesting as through this process, you would release your energy. So you would start crying. And like sometimes we were joking, like, okay, she's gonna cry. So like you would cry, and it would almost be like event cry. You know what I mean? Like that. And so there were a couple times when like we would have a connection point again, and I would not cry, and you'd be like, "Why? How come you didn't cry?" Because
sometimes you would cry too.
Yeah, sometimes
you were saying you like me, like I would cry, but sometimes you would cry.
Yeah, well, there were times I would cry too, but there were times that I wouldn't cry, and you would be like, "How come you're not crying?" And what was really interesting, because I've thought about this, is, there was times I'd feel bad about it. I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not crying about this? But I think what I was really, really so focused on was like,
Being
I
present.
wanted to be present for you
Yeah.
and provide that. And then there were times when I would cry. There were times when, like, I think what always got me was not necessarily I think I would feel like very thankful for you that you would, push this. Cause I was never like, hey, can we do that exercise where you get naked in front of me? I never pushed it. These were always kind of your things. And so I was always just very thankful that you would engage in the process.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because you don't know, hindsight's 2020, of course, but you don't know where it's ultimately going to end up. But my real goal was to be present for you, and I wanted to be there when you cried, because I think there were times I was like, she's going to cry. And so,
well, yeah, there was, I think actually it's a really good point. I think there was a point at which you sort of anticipated trauma release to an extent.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, so we have to be careful about that too, right? So that we're there if it happens, but we don't necessarily plan on you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to every time.
Yeah, right. And so like, I think for myself, I went through this period of time where I was like, what's wrong with me? Why am I not crying?
Mm-hmm.
But I was still feeling it. I was still feeling the gravity of the moment. I was feeling the vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
I was all of those things. And sometimes I would cry later. I think you've noticed that in me. Like, sometimes I'll tell a story and then I'll feel the emotions of that moment versus like in the moment itself, or something like that. So, but yeah, it was.
There were definitely times where we would do something and then you'd feel so overwhelmed that we accomplished it that you would cry too. And then there were other times where it was such a scary thing for me that when I accomplished it, trauma released from my body and I would cry. And so it was just a really, really interesting process to actually say, okay, this is what I'm scared of. We're going to do this together and we're going to create a safe environment for it. And to that point, we did eventually make it all the way to having our, but that too, we treated as a trauma exercise. Right. Very, very much.
Very slow.
Yeah.
No expectation.
Yeah. But, again, being like super present and communicative. Mm-hmm. And something I think I want to just mention for the couples that are working through this is, like I said, I think I said this earlier in this episode, is like trauma does get stored in the body. Right. And if you have a lot of fear or insecurity or pain around this particular area, there might be a lot stored in your pelvis. Mm-hmm. So even if you feel great and connected and get to the point where you're regularly engaging sexually together, be aware that things like intercourse or orgasm or things like that might be trauma releasing for you, because there's stuff still stuck in the fascia or in the organs themselves, in that there's so much around the hips and the uterus and just the pelvic region, right. For men and women, not that you have a uterus, but in the hips region and in the pelvic region for both. That a lot of trauma and a lot of emotions are stored in that area. So as you begin to re-engage, don't be afraid to communicate to each other, and do know that sometimes crying might, so for me, there's been situations where I've been crying because it was just so scary, or because it was just obviously trauma moving through my body. Mm-hmm. There's been other times where I've cried because it felt very connected. And I was like, oh my gosh, like we finally, like we did it, like we made it after all of this time and all of this effort, and here's my reward. And that felt very overwhelming. Right. And so there's different ways that the emotion might move through your body, many of which might come out in tears. Yeah. And there's been times where I've almost had like panicky cries after we've engaged together physically, because it's like so much had been stuck in my body and so much needed to come out. And so just giving you guys permission that is okay, that's normal. And I don't know how you feel about it, but I think those situations actually bring you closer together when you can hold that space to allow somebody to feel whatever it is that they feel. Mm-hmm. In any moment at any time.
And if you look over a lifetime, whatever your timeline is, 90 days, 8 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, if you're moving towards a point of connection, that's not a long time. And because the reward really plays itself out. And you held the vision, you had the vision, we moved to it. It took time. It was maybe you wished it had gone a little bit faster than it had, but the fact of the matter is we're here, and it doesn't, while recovery seems like a long time, it's these daily victories that you have that ultimately lead to a point where you know that you can have a month's worth of victories, and then 6 months worth of victories, and a year's worth of victories. And so the victories come by these small actions, and and so that's what leads to the real growth that can happen, and the connection that's there. So I always encourage people, like, don't put timelines to it. Like I said at the beginning, don't put timelines to it. Don't do comparisons. You do you as a couple, and you work very hard on that, and don't be afraid to say, hey, we've got to stop tonight, and maybe we come back to it, and let's try to reconnect again, or you know what I mean? So just
the stopping and the starting. Sometimes it's a trauma exercise. It's not, with a goal of getting to a certain whatever.
Right.
I think the process that we just described, which again, that's a lot to share publicly.
Yeah.
So gosh, I hope it's helpful for people and not traumatizing.
It will be.
Okay. But I think the process that we just described it's our version. Your version might be very different, and that's okay. But I do think that some of the conversations that I've had with people around this, sharing my story, it seems like this is sort of a process that a lot of people might benefit from. And that's really why we wanted to share it. And this process, I think, is a process that answers the question of, what is something that I can do when we're so hurt and the relationship is so damaged that will really pull back all the layers to allow us both to be fully seen?
Right.
And that's really the goal. Is like, how do you do that? And it doesn't have to be the way we did it. And it's also, what type of relationship are you moving towards? And so I pulled this up when you were talking. There's a little meme that I posted on Instagram. It's the log of a tree that's been cut down, and you see the tree rings, right? And a couple inches out from the center, there's a full circle of like what would be 1 or 2 or 3 tree rings maybe that were rotten. So there's like almost like hollow or rotten or whatever. But then the tree kept growing. And so there's the center that is the normal tree rings, and then the outer, and it's all normal and healthy. And it says, moral of the story, you can have a few rotten years and still thrive.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And so I was just thinking about that might be perfect in context of what we're talking about. The betrayal was horrible. The addiction was horrible. I won't say that this process of reestablishing true intimacy was great either. It's hard, right? But there were beautiful moments along the way, and it laid the foundation for us to be able to get to this place where now it's okay for us to talk about it.
That's right.
And it's okay for you and me to talk about it, and for us to talk to other people about it, and for us to connect. And it laid this foundation for literally the rest of our lives to only get better and get closer and get deeper and more connected. And I don't know that we could have accomplished that in very many other ways than the way we chose it. And again, our way may not be your way, but we just want to communicate that whatever your version of this is, we want to create that hope for you, that when you're open and honest and willing to communicate and create the safe space for each other, it can become a beautiful thing in your relationship.
Absolutely.
Anything else that you want to talk about? Because see, that's trauma moving through. We just talked about a really hard thing publicly.
Yeah, right.
The air and the trauma needs to move through my body. We did it.
Yes, we did. Good job.
All right. We'll see you next week. Woohoo! If you're listening to this, it means you've made it through an entire episode. Part of recovery is spending time engaging in healing and self-growth activities. We are thankful that you chose our podcast to be one of those activities today. Make sure you reward yourself for that accomplishment. If you have enjoyed this episode or this podcast, we would love to hear from you. Please take just a few moments to leave a rating and review, letting us know your experience with Recover You. We not only love hearing how these episodes are helpful, but ratings and reviews help others just like you who are searching for recovery information and support find the podcast too. We can't wait to hear from you. See you next week.